At TBX 2022, I was in a panel about IT ethics, moderated by Monique van Dusseldorp and also with the other panelists Jason Hart of Rapid7 and Dr. Stefan Buijsman from the TU Delft.
All of you work on systems that start to be self-running, but are not, and still need some human interaction and some ethical decisions. And it's not easy to build ethics into a system. Now let's first go all Black Mirror here. What is the worst, what is the worst example that we could end up with? I mean, we're working on these systems now, but there's no guarantee that, well, in your case, there's the biotech part. That's especially scary to a lot of people, right? Not to the Chinese, maybe, but
yeah.
For a lot of people here, they feel like we start tinkering with the actual cells. We can see benefits, we can program cells, we can develop new materials, we can solve diseases, etc., etc. But there is a very dark thing there as well. Could you explain a little bit, what is the worst that could happen?
Well, one of the things I think about is the grey goo theory. And that's a theory where you start, for example, to modify organisms, for example, to help us with oil leakage in the ocean. But then the cells start to replicate and multiply, and then in the end take over the world, just as there are these kind of theories, of course, about AI. But
it's a little bit like bringing exotic plants or animals into an ecosystem, and you think like, oh, this will be nice. The people in Africa will have nice big fish in the lake, and the whole lake is empty because all the big fish eat all the small fish. So something goes wrong that people didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
Because they flourish. Okay, and you're thinking more on the level of bacteria, cells, that sort of application.
Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think when you saw my talk, I think on every application I highlighted the benefits, but you can make the same case about things that could go wrong if malefactors used it. But yeah, when I think about your question, I think about the Greek theory. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people in this world who want bad things to happen as well, and there's a lot of money there, and there's a lot of intelligence there, and a lot of... Okay, what about the security part? I mean, I know you work hard to help companies be resilient and be able to protect, but don't you sometimes think like it's, I mean, the worst thing that can happen? What's the worst thing that can happen? That basically, I was really shocked when I realized that, for instance, there's in a lot of laptops in the US, because the US government, they can tap into things without anybody ever being aware of their whole laptop being tapped, right? I mean, it's a very small example, but what's the worst thing that could happen?
If we take from your example of the big fish going to the small fish going to a big fish, the data, the approach of that being weaponized in a way. So unless security is kind of default from that process, then that ultimately can be a target to be weaponized to cause other issues, not necessarily technical issues, but ethical issues or humanitarian issues or whatever. So it's compromising something which then can be weaponized against the world. A really good example would be data integrity. So if I can alter the data without actually anyone knowing I've altered the data, that data then is used from a science perspective to make an informed decision. So actually that informed decision is created, and downstream it becomes live, and then you realize the data that you used, the integrity was incorrect, and you can't go back and retrofit that.
You cannot take it back, because the system learns also if the data is incorrect.
Yeah.
So and there's also this scary thing that if there's really an arms race between the bad guys trying to attack all the companies and the good guys who try to protect, the arms race means that both get smarter. I mean, you basically pull the other party into much smarter activities.
I think to date we've seen, the world today, it's been what I call like a confidentiality breaches. So, the confidentiality has been breached or targeted, and at a point in time we know about it. The one that scares me is the integrity, where the data is altered, and we make a business decision or we make a scientific decision, and 5 years, 6 years, 10 years downstream, we assume that data was correct, but actually it was incorrect, and we've made huge decisions on it, and it could have effects on people's lives.
Well, that's actually very close to your topic as well. I mean, the data being used to train the models, and once the models are out there, it's very hard to reel them back in, right? I mean,
yes, yeah, and I think that's also where the real challenges are, not just in terms of, okay, well, you're not entirely sure what your models are going to behave. If you're not actively looking out for AI discrimination, then it's not going to show up anywhere. Yeah. You have to do the tests. But it's also that it turns out that human oversight on AI systems is really difficult. So a lot of the time you'll get that either the AI system says something and the operator will just automatically agree. This is what happened also in the social benefits scandal.
I must be right.
Yeah, it's like they must be right. Or they're under so much pressure to agree with the system that they will just click yes all the time because they don't have the time to check. They don't have the authority to really disagree. And then things go wrong despite all our best intentions.
Now, the system you described, there were some very clear rules and some very clear data sets on which some decisions are made. So you could, once the decisions are out there, sort of calculate back and find out why some decisions were made. But, I mean, if you look, for instance, right now at the synthetic media, you know, the people that develop prompts to generate a certain picture, the prompt can be this long, and you see the picture, but once you see the picture, it's almost impossible to deduce the prompt that generated the picture. I mean, the connections are really, really hard to make, right? Do you think your model that you suggested made me think like, oh, but we can track those decisions. It's not that hard, and then you just have to calculate it. But don't you think we're going to a future where not even the smartest people can figure out why the AI decided what it decided?
Well, I think in a lot of cases we're already there. So if you take the really large models, whether it's to generate images or write text or even to make decisions, they end up with millions or trillions of parameters, and there's no way to really trace back. So yes, you can calculate how much a particular input parameter contributed to the output, but you don't know why the model thought that gender was particularly important in this case. So you still miss a lot of the important information in terms of the whys.
Yeah.
Because you know, okay, it looked at this, but what did it see there? Why did it look at this? We don't really have answers for any of those questions.
Now, you all three work on these systems believing you can make them better, so you are positive people. Starting with you and then coming back here. I mean, there's a lot of discriminatory AI because AI uses the data set that exists in the world, and the world is discriminatory. So, you know, it's men, women, white, non-white. There's lots of things that happen there. But could you not also argue that the AI could also be better than people? I mean, it always suggests it's terrible because it's like people. But if you can make the rules good and clear and have the right data sets, it could be better, right? It could be ethically superior to people. We should put our lives into the... No, okay, go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there are definitely things that you can do with AI systems that are much harder with people. So going through these kinds of statistical, we want it to be equally accurate for everyone, that's much more feasible for AI systems than it is for going to human doctors and adjusting their experience. A human will
always think, oh, it's a woman. Oh, that's not a white person. Oh, the person doesn't look like me. Yeah. I don't really understand them.
So it's much more, you can quantify it more easily, and as a result, you can intervene more easily. But it doesn't make it any easier to determine, okay, what do we actually want in terms of fair decisions? What is it that what outcome do we want to reach? Defining that is still really difficult, and that's something that we need to do before you can program anything. And even then, if you really want to enforce these strict equality measures, often accuracy of these systems drops by 30, 40 percentage points. Ooh, just because the world isn't equal and it has learned from the world, and you can try to enforce your picture of how it should be, but it doesn't have any data to learn from to what this new picture should be. So yes, we can do something, but there are really difficult trade-offs to make nevertheless.
And I can imagine it's also very different country to country what ethical trade-offs people are willing to make. I mean, it's not the same everywhere, not the same value sets, not the same decisions.
Yeah, values differ in countries, across countries. That makes it even harder.
I mean, for Jason, I was thinking, like, what is the ethics dilemma when you work in cybersecurity like you do? I mean, is it, you describe this, you know, figuring out what is the most precious data, figuring out what is valuable and what is not, and then adapting your security measures to what is there. I mean, are there ever decisions in companies? There must be. Like, okay, we have ransomware. These people are threatening to release our 100,000 data set of children that bought toys from our store. This costs us so much money. These children don't have credit cards anyway. We might as well release the data because it's not that much harmful. It's not more harmful to us than to them, really. So let it go. That's an ethical dilemma, right?
Yeah, the ethical dilemma is particularly kind of when a breach occurs. So you've got, first of all, the data that's been exposed or compromised. So you've got a dilemma: do you inform those individuals? So because it's privacy. In all cases, I would advise that you do advise and do a breach disclosure. The second element is if there's if the hackers of ransomware essentially put a safe around your critical data or the sensitive data, do you pay the ransomware attack? So there's a lot of ethical issues which you need to consider. Most organizations haven't even considered or modeled that approach out. If we go back,
have you ever that you went to the CEO and said, okay, we have a problem, all your customer data is going to be out there, and so will all your personal email correspondence and app correspondence? Oh, well, in that case, I mean...
It happens on a daily basis. So before I started the keynote today, I had a call from an organization who were compromised, and they've got exactly this dilemma. And, again, because they had lots of technology, but the business process on what should we do in the event, have we got backup data, is marketing involved, is HR involved, is there basically incident response in place? They're running around like headless chickens. Yeah. And this is all preventable. Yeah. And it's just a case of thinking things through and doing the basics.
So you have to have the worst scenario in your head as well as the best scenario.
And it comes back to just in any organization, what is the critical business function? And then what is that data in that business function? And what's the approach if something was to occur? Yeah. And just knowing those 3 or 4 things, it sets you up to be able to deal with scenarios that eventually may occur.
But why do companies do not train and do these simulations?
Exactly. I don't know. They just assume...
They feel safe. They say, we spent money on it. We're safe.
Yeah.
They just assume, technology is going to solve the problem. It's the process. Yeah. And, come back to, like all 3 of our industries, it's people, technology, process. Everyone tends to align to the technology, but unless you have the appropriate process and controls and approaches for people, it all falls down. Yeah. And we have to move away. Technology gives you the data, but then you've got to use that data in an informed way to drive the rest of the process.
Now take it from the data and take it back to the biology. I mean, obviously we all live in a world where all our data gets collected all the time. I mean, 30 years ago, nobody would have believed you that you would walk around with a little thing so you can be tracked all over the earth, and every interaction that you have will be stored somewhere. And this is, of course, going to get worse and worse. I mean, this morning we had a session about the metaverse and VR sets, which can not just measure where you look and your pupil dilating, but also your skin tension and your heartbeat. And there are data systems that know more about ourselves than maybe we want to know. Now, when you come back to the biology part, you mentioned that you did this test on your DNA. You found out some things which were interesting, but for a lot of people, it might be better not to know everything. No, but if you know you will have you have 80% chance of early dementia. Yeah. Do you want to know, or do you want to spend the first 50 years of 50 years okay, and misery comes when it comes. It could be. Yeah.
Well, that's a good point, and I think also when I did a commercial genetic test, I was also more naive, I think, about the possibilities and also about the ramifications of, because I did the test at 23andMe, and I also
which then got sold to an insurance company or something.
Indeed, I think they sold some of their data to a pharmaceutical company. Yeah. So it could benefit the patients in these kinds of studies, but that's another ethical dilemma indeed. So maybe if a user of that service, I could also have the choice, like, do I pay a premium so that I only have my data, but maybe if I have a discount, I also donate my data to certain
to research purposes.
Yeah, research purposes. But that was not your question. Your question is how will it determine your outlook on life? And I think at the time I made a good, valid choice. But we as humans, we are also not very well at thinking about chances and risks. Like, for example, if there's a 2 times more chance of a certain illness, well, if it's from 0.1 till 0.2,
you still assume you're going to be in the...
Or
not, you know, you get a 1% chance of illness, and you're going to assume you will be the one. You know.
Yeah, and that also had to do with Stefan's talk about, how do these AI systems also predetermine certain outcomes, and the same applies to how... I was also interested that in the table you showed with the rural and these kinds of things. Maybe, I would not like to also have genetic data as one of those columns, but that could be a future application. So, but again, that's ethics.
You're from a family that never pays back their loans, so we're not giving you the loan. I mean,
it's in my genetics. I can help it. So.
Questions from the audience, and about any of these 3 topics. I mean, it doesn't have to be a question for everybody, for all 3 members. Who wants to ask a question? We have a microphone coming up if
Can I ask before? Or?
Yeah, take it, and then we'll wait for the microphone to arrive here.
I was lately at a talk by a colleague of yours, and he stated that 98% of all cybersecurity issues could be dealt with in a very easy way, like multi-factor authentication. How do you... And in that way, if you're even a little bit more secure than other companies, then the hackers would go to the other companies. What's your take on that?
100%. You know, obviously there's always the small percentage where that you can actually prevent it, but in most cases, breaches can be prevented. They can be, you can detect. You know, quite easily, everyone here today, there would be 30 or 40 things that you could implement, or processes or controls you can put in place to vastly reduce your risk. Again, you've got to use the data, you've got to identify the key parts of an organization. So I think you were out walking around, but in my keynote, I clearly said the scope. So what's happening? People are spraying bits of security everywhere. That security is not contextual to the level of risk that's being mitigated based on that business functional data. So we've got to get that balance right. And as I said, this is kind of the evolution of the cyber. It's like profit and loss. You know, we manage our P&L, financial loss, in an effective way. And we need to do that with cybersecurity. We need to apply more security controls, less security controls, and we need to get that balance right. And that's really making it part of the business process. But to answer your question, yes, I agree. Most security breaches are preventable.
For Stefan, you mentioned at the start that there's an EU framework for ethics and AI. You also mentioned explainability is a very difficult topic. I was just browsing while you guys were setting up your chairs. There's a nice article on Vice saying the same thing. It's becoming more and more difficult. So how, if you've got on the one side that framework that says companies, I'm looking at from the company point of view, companies, when they bring out tooling, etc., that employ AI, need to be ethical. How do you prove that you are? How do you prove that you're complying? Is there going to be a certifying body, or should we have something like that?
Yeah, so of course the details of the AI Act are still being hammered out, but there will be certifying bodies to some extent. So there's the standard committees are working out the exact details. What I think most of this is going to come down to, so for explainability, for example, the Act currently says that it's best efforts. So you should be doing as much as you can in the cases where it matters. It might become a little stricter. than just best efforts, because in some cases maybe we think explainability is so important you just shouldn't do AI technology that you don't understand until we reach that point. I think for all the other ethical qualifications, though, so things like fairness, accountability, and so on, we have separate measures. So even if you don't understand exactly how the AI system makes its decisions, you can do a statistical test on does it discriminate, yes or no. And likewise, you can have accountability measures in place and you can test them for effectiveness. You can test your human oversight. Okay, if we intentionally let through a mistake, is that corrected, yes or no? Can people contest decisions? What happens then? So a lot of this can be worked around, even if you don't understand the technology itself completely, or at least you don't understand why it gives certain outputs. You can still do KPI testing on all of the other ethical criteria that you set out. But to do that effectively, you need to have it into design requirements, worked out, okay, this is what fairness means for me with this particular technology.
There was a discussion an hour ago regarding the metaverse and Web 3.0. We had some incidents recently regarding some molestation in one of those metaverse programs, and this particularly with youngsters, because more and more younger generations are attracted to the kind of, the playfulness of these metaverse avatars and being in that virtual landscape. So what is the ethical landscape and where is it progressing towards? What's the future of this, from a moral and ethical sense? Where is it leading us towards?
Ooh, a big question maybe. Maybe too big, but
maybe
somebody wants to have a go?
Yeah, maybe if we've got this new world being created, and everything we do from a legal construct point of view today has to evolve into that new world. Now, that's a huge ethical issue generally. Everything that we do in a virtual world, how does that apply from a legal construct? It's bad enough from a cybersecurity perspective. There's different jurisdiction. So if a hacker undertakes a breach from a country which has no real cybersecurity laws, then breaches another country via another region and an organization. The jurisdiction on that is just horrific. In fact, in most cases, it actually never goes to prosecution. So we're going to see those same issues, I believe, from a kind of a virtual world as well.
Yeah, I think the big benefit here is that the AI Act, as it's currently being formulated, risks sort of labels all technologies that relate to children as high risk. So then there are very strict ethical frameworks on that you have to comply to. And they are intending to cover any technology that impacts EU citizens. So it doesn't have to be on the EU market. Even if it's not being deployed in Europe, but still impacts people here, it's being covered, and you can get fined and you can get excluded from Europe as a company if you're really, really breaching the rules. So they're putting a lot of stress there on legal frameworks.
If I'm in the metaverse and I undertake an act, what's the audit trail? How do you make them accountable if I, verbally or I physically did something?
Yeah, but I think that's a question for the companies putting out the metaverse technologies. Okay. If the impact ultimately ends up with EU citizens and children in particular, and it clearly negatively affects them in important ways, then we can just say, okay, you shouldn't do this version of the metaverse anymore, and the European Union could, in principle, retract it from the European market.
Yeah, but I think it could also be an opportunity, because I was thinking my gut reaction is, oh, it's negative, and we got in big trouble, because I hope we learned from how the internet developed as a platform, and we put these lessons into practice for the metaverse. But the point I want to make is we can, of course, also use the metaverse as a sort of training ground for ethical dilemmas. So maybe Stefan is rolling his eyes when I mentioned the trolley problem. But if you do it in a metaverse, maybe it feels more real, and you can make your own.
I don't know if you ever looked at all the avatars. I mean, I made my own Ready Player Me avatar. Now I look fantastic. I look young. I'm slim. I'm tall. I'm everything I'm not. I mean, the metaverse has this inclination to grow into this standard space. the real world is much more diverse than the metaverse because everybody has an ideal in their head and they build themselves to that ideal, and they do. I mean, you can't blame people.
But are we, you know, like we have the dark web, are we going to have the dark metaverse?
We have the underground metaverse, sure, absolutely. We have 4 more minutes. I have last questions for every one of you. Starting with you. You describe models to mitigate some of the dangers that come with AI. You work at the university. You're very involved also with European projects and policy projects. Are companies also actively approaching you for help? I mean, how does your work go to the industry? Because that's where it should be, right?
Yes, yeah, so we have a lot of these collaborative projects, to name a few, with the banks on transaction monitoring, with the Dutch government on social security sector, where they want to use AI to streamline the process. So there are a lot of cases where, for us, it's important that the research that you're doing actually translates into something concrete.
Yeah, it's not just the academic model.
Ethics in the void. No, it should be grounded into specific applications. And I think very often that's where you find the interesting problems. And it's, like, as you say, not going to be the trolley problem, but it's going to be something like, okay, people in driverless cars not being able to take over control fast enough because they've fallen asleep, that kind of thing. So for us, it's really...
What was this thing in the UK where if you touch the wheel of a driverless car, you're automatically responsible?
Yes.
So the sensible thing would be, if you see an accident going to happen, take your hands away from the steering wheel so that at least the insurance company can't blame you. I mean, that's an ethical dilemma. Yeah.
Yeah, so for us, exactly, it's very much in collaboration with companies who run into these problems.
And for you, you run a company and you work with big companies. So where does your intelligence come from? Do you work with academia, or is it basically companies that develop the new tools, or where are things happening?
It's from a cyber perspective, is reference points from, you know, everywhere. So from the dark web, the threat actors, business models. You know, cybersecurity is one of very few unique domains that touches every single part of an organization. Yeah. So ultimately, cybersecurity, it's becoming more of a, you know, if a CISO's role, Chief Information Security role, is becoming more of a chief operating officer, because they need to have cause and effect.
Organizational, psychological.
It touches every part. It's a huge domain.
Yeah. Now we saw the Chinese developing, you know, making every use of CRISPR they can, and you know, they also make these little cute piglets that will never grow up, and there's a lot happening there, right? Where else in the world is this really being developed? This biotech, or tech bio, as they sometimes call it, where you can program cells, you can develop new materials, you can discover more about the human body, you can adapt more in the human body. Where is this happening? This is big universities or big tech?
Mostly in the United States. And what's also interesting is that you see the big tech companies also involved in this domain, like Google investing in money in longevity research, which also has to do with biotech. I'm not sure what Meta is doing in this field, but also Saudi Arabia also funded a new initiative. So that also, of course, has to do with ethics. Like, do we think that big tech has played a good role, and do we also want that?
You do have to feel that we can talk all about ethics that we want, but if the people running this industry are from Saudi Arabia, China, and things are happening that might not be our wish.
Yeah, but then I feel rather pessimistic, so I'm not...
end on a positive note.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank all three of you for having this insight into your industry, and strangely enough, into systems and how they can go wrong and how hard we have to work to make them go right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.